I'm Carlton King, former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe for free.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations, but actually majors on geopolitics. And in doing that, what we do is we look at all various types of things. And the reason why I say we, because as per usual, I'm working with my podcast wife, my partner in crime, the famous number one, Firgas Isaac. Fergus, how are you doing, kiddo?
I'm all right, Carlton. I'm all right. So we're doing we're doing that threesome thing again today.
Oh, love it.
we are. I believe we're. I know we were bucking the trend before, but I like to think we're starting a new trend now. I like to think we've thrown that podcast rule book out the window, and now we've picked up the quill. We've picked up that quill, and we're now rewriting the rules.
That's the one. The full fader. That's the one.
Schreiber, we've picked up that quill. So. A few episodes back, like quite a few episodes back now, we had Dr. Rachel Taylor, neuropsychologist Dr. Rachel Taylor, on for a double episode, talking about the menopause, which we now know, thanks to Dr. Rachel, is called the andropause. We had lots of people were really interested in that, and I think, you know, as with every conversation with Dr. Rachel, we all learn something, we all take something away. But in episode 2, she touched very briefly on weight loss. And we had quite a few listeners get in touch asking about this, saying that they'd like to know more about this. And when I mentioned this to you, Carlton, we said, actually, fast food and diet culture is a global issue. And so we thought, look, let's get Dr. Rachel back on again to talk about this. But before I hand over, or you know, before we kind of intro her again, and hopefully she's familiar to your listeners now, but the fast food industry globally is worth 998 billion.
Incredible,
right? That's nothing compared to the alcohol industry, which is worth over 2 trillion.
Incredible.
One stat that I find quite shocking, and this is an ONS stat, is that British families spend 16% of their food budget on fast food.
I can believe it.
And then, you know, and then the World Health Authority, I mean, you know, they've got some terrifying stats. You know, obesity has tripled since 1975.
That's right.
More children in the world die of obesity than malnourishment.
That is incredible,
isn't it?
So you mean they die with things like blood pressure problems, just simple straightforward weight problems, diabetes? What else would be related to it?
Well, I think this is a good time to hand over to our esteemed guest.
Absolutely.
Well,
Esteemed you are.
well, I'm feeling quite lucky to be called esteemed, so I intend that I fulfill the brief today.
Brilliant.
But yeah, I mean, God, obesity is just taking off. You know, and you know, as I spoke before to, you know, around the environment and how we have to change the environment, not the person. So the availability of food and the type of food that's available is contributing massively to you know, what has been, you know, named an obesity pandemic. And it's really interesting to me as both a professional, as a neuroscientist, but also from a personal perspective, the sort of reactions and responses that are around about this. You know, certainly you can see how our leaders and the parties that they represent are funded, when you see the lack of challenges to the big food industry, and including sort of the big farms and all that, and how they grow the food. But it sort of goes all the way down the chain until you get, you know, your little Just Eat takeaway on the high street. You know, you can see how insidious all of this is, and what kind of money is involved, and how you know, that money actually sort of takes away any kind of public health messaging around that food. So no wonder people are either don't know what they're doing, confused about what they're doing, or just think, I don't care what I'm doing anymore. You know, the messaging is very mixed around the kind of food that we're eating.
Well, let's look at the money thing, because, you know, so the majority, in my understanding, in the UK, the majority of fast food and alcohol carries a 20% VAT surcharge, and then, you know, there's the import and export you know, economy on those foods, based on the supply and demand that's been generated through advertising, through culture, through you know, through convenience.
Yeah.
You know, so that's one I'm going to throw back to Carlton. What is fast food worth to the global economy?
Yeah, I mean, look, I haven't looked at the stats like you have. What I've looked at is the prevalence of the factors that lead to a whole host of other issues. So, example, if we look at the Ukraine war, when that came fish and chip shops, that we can't get the oil anymore. Then we heard people turn around in fish and chip shops and say, we can't get the flour anymore, because the Ukraine was the breadbasket of the East, along with Russia. So then we started looking at issues like it's difficult now to get fish because the waterways have a problem, etc., etc. So what we can see is that there's a massive movement of goods relating to how fast food is made. We then look at things like chickens. And when you hear stories of, and this is what I'll come back to Rachel soon, of them using growth hormones in chickens, we then look at the fact that the way that they're feeding them, the certain types of feed that they're feeding them. We could then go back even, funnily enough, I was just talking about this the other day, and it's incredible how all things come together, isn't it? I was talking to my sister, and we were speaking about the problem with Alzheimer's, etc. And she said, I think the problem is mad cow disease, right? And I thought for a second, and I thought to myself, right, Creutzfeldt-Jakob syndrome, as it was called originally, if you remember. Yeah. And I thought, yes, at that time in 2002, I started a new unit called Strategic Analysis Unit of the National Public Order Intelligence Unit. So what my job was basically to look at things that would be an issue for the United Kingdom between, let's say, 2 and 5 years, and then write in-depth papers, you know, many, many pages with my team, and then we'd send it off to government and to senior police, military, the agencies, security intelligence agencies, and they'd look at it so they could prepare themselves for whatever the case would be. And the reason why I mentioned this is because at the time I was asked to look at mad cow disease and how that is affecting the United Kingdom. Because you remember at the time, there were literally pyres of burning cattle. I mean, millions of them just burning. You could drive up the motorway and smell the burning of these dead cattle. And it was destroying Britain's cattle industry. And you went so far as, in order to try and prevent it, a minister eating a hamburger patty supposedly from Britain and then passing it to his daughter saying, you know, you can eat this, it's good food. Right. So I went to see this scientist guy, Home Office scientist, these guys. And I'll never forget what this fella said to me. He said, if you think there's a problem with cattle, look at lamb. I said, excuse me? He said, look at lamb, look at the problem with lamb. Now, shortly thereafter, I started to get this paper to put the foundation together. I was the one who was going to write it. And then they came back to me with something else. I think it might have been actually avian flu. Can you guys do something on avian flu? Well, we're doing something on animal rights. We're doing something on the extreme right wing, left wing, etc., and one on nuclear. So they said, can you do this? So I didn't have the manpower. So we dropped, in fact, I was now told to drop the Creutzfeldt-Jakob syndrome thing and work on the other issues that they wanted to do. So we dropped it. So I never went any further to investigate it. But you see, what was being hidden there? And this brings us back to this, not just fast food, to food in general. What are we eating?
Well, yeah, I agree. And, you know, as a mom, and I think as soon as you become a parent, you become incredibly, you become much more aware of what you're putting on the table for your children's growth and development, but also, you know, to keep yourself healthy so that you can be a good parent, I suppose. You know, not that people don't previously, but you know, I mean, I think my overarching point, my overarching thinking on all of this, I suppose, is that obesity is preventable, but politically fast food is convenient, right?
But the point I'm making on that one, Fergus, is I just don't think it's fast food. I think it's all food.
Right. So look, Carlton, I read somewhere that per person, right, in North Korea, they consume less sugar in a year than the average American consumes in one day.
I can see that.
Right. And somewhere, Singapore's banned sugar advertising.
Right.
Right. There are countries that just consume, but I don't know if sugar's the enemy. I mean,
that's what I'm saying. It could be anything.
Why we've got Dr. Rachel
Absolutely.
on here.
And Rachel, just before I come into that, see, anecdotally, I will say to you, the Chinese population, as a general, I used to go to China a lot at one stage, and as a general rule, you saw relatively few to very few fat Chinese. But when you went to Singapore, which I went to as well, a couple of times, 3, 4, 5 times, whatever it was, you saw fat Chinese. So in a strange way, it was, you know, people, obviously the Singaporeans, but of Chinese heritage. So it's not that it's metabolically something in the Chinese body system in terms of normal body look. It's something that clearly relates to what they're eating. And clearly in Singapore, they're eating things that weren't as good as, for your body shape at least, as they were in China. Now, I'd love to see, since I've not been to China now since I left, so, you know, really for like 10 years, I'd love to see how Chinese look now. So this is what I want to put to you, Rachel. I want you to have a look at and just sort of come to us with this whole panoply of problems. Yeah. Yes, fast food, but also general food. And can I just add one more thing, because I'm noticing it? I used to say there was a dead giveaway in the Bible. And that was the moment that the Bible said, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's and give unto the Lord what is the Lord's, I knew that the Romans had controlled it. So the moment I see the fast food industry making all these foods that you now have that are meant to be plant food, you know, then I think they've now taken it over and doing exactly the same with plant-based food as they've done with meats.
Well, plant. That's a whole different podcast. We could literally, I could fill hours talking about plant-based food and processed plant-based food. But in terms of what you were saying, well, let's take it right back to how we began, how Homo sapiens began, because I tell people this all the time, particularly with the brain mechanisms, in that our brain and body has not evolved, we've not adapted since we became the ultimate sort of bipedal entity on Earth. So we are actually have a mechanism that is meant to thrive really on having little. We're meant to be able to survive on having little. So we have that, first of all, that our mechanism is there for having little. The other thing is that obviously part of our evolution is that we didn't have foods which literally had 15, 16 ingredients within them. You know, we have a whole food, and now, you know, sort of nutritionists, scientists sort of say, you know, you should eat whole foods, but if you buy anything processed, don't have anything with more than 5 ingredients.
Right, is that a scientific thing?
Because you know, the more ingredients that there are in the food, the more that you're guaranteed that it's been messed with in some way, that there's been some sort of you know, cheap and easy formula to produce this food. And really, you know, this is like the dark side of science. You'll have a whole laboratory of biochemical scientists who are working on recipes that actually are going to taste good to the person. So they're going to actually utilize the reward part of the brain, which will then want to have more of that food, and do it in the cheapest way possible to get maximum profit. You know, food industry is not geared up as sort of an altruistic industry, is it? It's not there for the good of our health, when really food should be there for the good of our health, because it actually, you know, is one of the main ingredients in well-being. Eating well keeps us well. So we have all of this sort of from an evolution perspective, is that our bodies and brains are geared up for us always to be on the edge of paucity, you know, the edge of starvation, because food was not, you know, readily available like it is now. And we also have within us hardwired that when food is available, eat as much as you can of it. You know, I always remember sort of reading an SAS biography where they said, you know, and if food is in front of you, just eat it, because you never know when you're going to find any other food. That basically is our survival brain as well. Eat as much as you can, because you don't know when the next meal is coming. Yeah. Apart from now, the next meal is literally just 10 minutes away. Yeah.
It's funny, isn't it? Because people always say, don't they, that during the rationing times of the war, you know, everyone was actually much healthier because it was all just a bit prescriptive, but also at the same time, you know, you got your rations, you kind of ate everything, and that, you know, I think that there was a sort of, you know, women during rationing used to just eat bread and potatoes if they wanted to lose weight, which is kind of an interesting sort of dichotomy, because now all the sort of major diet programs would tell you that the last thing you want to be eating is bread and potatoes. But, you know, obviously it worked, because, you know, you see all these sort of tiny waisted 1940s women, don't you?
Yeah. And I think, you know, you have to sort of you need to understand as well the sort of the pleasure aspect of food. Now, if you are one of the lucky ones, which I am, very lucky, and I say that tongue in cheek, to have a dopamine phenotype, which means that you never find pleasure in food, you know, it becomes very difficult to know when you've had enough. But most people have sort of the dopamine mechanism in their reward system, where actually gets pleasure from food. So there's a whole psychology around eating. It's not just for survival. It's for you know, having that ritual around you know, celebrating with friends and family. You know, and we're meant to have this, and certainly the Mediterranean diet actually embraces this a lot. You know, it's a really good way of eating. But what we have in this country, and I know you've mentioned sort of the convenience of it, and certainly in the US it's very convenient as well. One key factor which I've noticed with people is that people are too tired to cook. People are too tired to do the sit down with the family. People are fatigued. There's too much going on. And often when we feel tired, we want to just reach for the food that's actually going to boost our energy instantaneously. And that generally is the convenience food, which is really not great for us. And it doesn't do anything nutritionally. It's very calorifically dense, but you've got no nutrients in it. So actually what we're doing is just taking on calories and not actually what we need for our body. So we still don't end up with any energy from it.
Dr. Rachel, can I just break in? Can I suggest that it's even more assiduous than that? Can I suggest that there was a time, a Germaine Greer time, when, and she's changed, when people used to say, because, you know, most of this feeding of people was done by the female, by the mother. Yeah? So she learned to cook from her mother and from her mother and from her mother and from her mother, etc. Yeah. Albeit that the top chefs were men. Now that is somebody playing around with the system, of course, that only chefs can be men. So we accept that, so we'll push that aside. But let's just say the actual feeding of the family, the most important factor, in the beginning seemed to be done, particularly in the Western world, by men, by women. Right? Yeah. But of course, then came out the Germaine Greer perspective of, I'm not a little housewife, therefore, why should I learn to cook? Right? So now what you've got is people don't know how to cook. Not only are they feeling tired, but they've, you know, you'll get many a person on and say, I don't know how to cook an egg, example. Right?
Well, yeah, exactly.
I'm proud of it.
Do you remember when Delia Smith brought out the book about how to boil an egg?
Yeah.
Proud of it, though. That's the point. Because that was suggesting that you were more than a housewife. When, of course, I would suggest being a housewife was actually something that was absolutely fundamental to the running of society.
Well, I completely agree, and I think, you know, quite often a lot of things that were predominantly female women roles have been completely devalued, as if they don't matter, as if you know, we can get rid of it completely and we'll not even notice that somebody's not picking up the slack. And you know, it's something really interesting to me is that no matter how busy or fatigued I am, I'd consider it a fail if my children didn't eat whole food. And I just laugh at myself with, you know, having that mentality in that, you know, it's something certainly that was very strong within me to keep. Well, I suppose it's like my own little protest against society. I mean, that no matter what else I'm being persuaded to do, I'm going to try and just, you know, do something that's going to be nutritionally sound. And I think for a lot of people, and I think this is inherent within society. I have lots of conversations with people like you, and it really saddens me, this whole mob mentality now. Well, you know, what can you do if other people are doing it? What can you do? As if we have to give in to you know, this convenience food, if we all have to be tired all the time, if we all have to allow people to be unkind and inhuman, you know, sort of allow the corruption, and it's almost like, well, you know, everybody's so apathetic, and it's sort of like this sort of, what can we do? And it's like, you can start a revolution in your own home, and you can actually say, I want to do different. I want to have healthy bodies. I want to have, you know, brains that are actually being nutritionally fed rather than just pinging because you're just activating your dopamine mechanism. You know, I get quite animated, you can imagine, talking, you know, in general public about things like this, because, yeah, it is difficult. Everybody is pressed for time. Everybody is, also they think, you know, when you just say, well, how much time do you spend zoning out on, you know, Netflix binging or whatever? You know, it's like everyone's, oh, I'm just so busy. Well, too busy to actually take care of what you're eating, you know. And I think it's really important to also mention as well is that, you know, it's when your body gets to a certain point in where sort of with weight, or if you have had an eating disorder at a young age, so like your hormones and your metabolic health in your body is, you know, really compromised by this. It's not as simple as saying to someone, eat less, move more. It's just not. And I think we need to sort of talk about that when people get to a certain point with obesity, then we need to stop blaming and shaming and accept responsibility that we have created the perfect environment where people either from putting their head in the sand or from confirmation bias, however you want to, you know, whatever kind of bias you want to pull out the hat there, for whatever reason, they have got to a point with their body mass that unless they have some sort of medical intervention, and it's still to this day, the best medical intervention for people who are morbidly obese is bariatric surgery, which is being renamed metabolic surgery. That's the best outcome, because that's the only outcome where you can guarantee that you will reset the hormonal system, where people will finally not be feeling hungry all the time or not satiated all the time. So
let me look at this now.
Yeah.
Because there'll be many people listening in right now, as Fergus said, many a person has spoken about what we said on the other podcast, and they'll now be listening in because this is a massive thing. I mean, if I look at mothers and then I look at daughters, the mother is generally a lot slimmer than the daughter is in many not always, don't get me wrong, that'd be silly to say that, but often that is the case because of a different generation. And my belief is, tell me if I'm wrong, that the muscle memory of the body learns very early on what they can and can't do in terms of, you know, the weight that it should have, and then it works to that process. Now, I don't know how that works. You can probably tell me about that. So that's why an older woman who, you know, for first 20 years, 30, 40 years of her life was slim because that's how we ate, then finds it difficult to become relatively fat because the body is used to that and the muscle memory of the body works to that. I'm only saying it from the perspective of knowing how, you know, kung fu works or shooting a weapon works. So you learn muscle memory. So what I'm sort of asking that, there'll be many people who, because that hasn't been taught them from a very early age on, because they were, you know, eating all the biscuits in the pack rather than just having one, like an old-fashioned person like me would have, you know, one biscuit and that'd be shared around several people. So because they've been used to the whole packet or whole packets of crisps all the time, or whatever, whenever they wanted it, because there was a wealth factor there, that then to try and change that when you're 20, when you understand what you're doing, is actually quite difficult. So can you start from that perspective? Can you give some understanding of that?
Yeah, well, you've got a number of factors going on at that point. You've got what is familiar to the brain, and the brain, as I've said before, it doesn't differentiate between good and bad. It doesn't care if you're happy or not. You know, its job is to keep you alive, but it does prefer familiar because it can predict the outcome to familiar. And as long as you're still alive at the end of the day, familiar is good enough for the brain. So you have those mechanisms, and the brain is so energy expensive, really, that it prefers for things to be an unconscious habit because it doesn't really have to put too much effort into that. So if you've had like this pattern of eating or pattern of inactivity or pattern of, I don't know, starvation, then overeating, whatever your patterns might be, then the brain prefers that. So then obviously the knock-on effect of that, particularly with weight issues, is the metabolism and the nervous system and all the hormones that go along that. I think, you know, most people don't understand the level of hormone activity that goes into regulating our body, and in particular regulating hunger and feeling full. And if we consistently overeat, then that actually sets the pattern that overeating is the norm for you, and the body just adjusts itself, you know, accordingly. And to date, the only intervention that successfully helps people to get rid of the excess weight and to keep it off, and there are some provisos with that as well, but for the majority of people, the only way to both lose it and keep it off is by having metabolic surgery. Plenty of people can diet and it'll do, but often they'll put it back on more besides, because actually up until now there is nothing that can actually reset the hormonal system so that you know when you're hungry, you know when you've had enough, like metabolic surgery, and that's just, I'm sure they'll like to come up with something that will challenge that in the future, but to date, not even any of these popular injections that you could take. As soon as you stop taking those injections, the weight comes back on.
Right.
So
is that so designed so you keep taking it?
Well, this is something really interesting. During the pandemic, when they were sort of bashing the obese for being the ones who were, taking up space in the intensive care. And I was like, what really baffled me was that, metabolic medicine is not my primary forte, because obviously I prefer other brain stuff. But even I thought, if you were serious about actually wanting to help these people, you wouldn't be getting them on metformin. You wouldn't be getting them unless you wanted to make money out of it. Because if somebody's on any kind of diabetes medication, they're on it for life. Right. You have to factor that in. If you were really serious about helping these people, you'd be giving them all all the ones who wanted it, bariatric surgery. You'd be telling them that, and they would be doing the research and understanding that if they wanted to have a healthier body, because this is not just about aesthetics, this is about unwellness.
Absolutely.
And literally, if you are overweight, you want to manage decline until, if they were really serious, given everything that's in the literature, everything that's in all the journals around obesity, they would be offering bariatric surgery.
Right. But you see, the other thing is, and Fergus, I know you wanted to come in, so you can come straight after me. I mean, the other thing is that you've got this, I don't like the word woke. I don't even know where it comes from. But anyway, let's use that terminology for now. That basically says if somebody's morbidly overweight, that's up to them. They want to be that way. And so why should you be saying anything to them? Because that's tantamount to shaming them. But yet still these individuals can say, I can't walk up the steps without my knees hurting me, my ankles hurting me, my heart's beating 55 to the dozen. I need some oxygen, etc., etc., etc. When I suggest most of that, you can put down to the fact that they're too large. So if that's the case, why shouldn't we say, actually, we'll give you some assistance for you not to be too large, rather than celebrating being large? I mean, I know I'm not sounding popular now, but I'm just trying to look at what it's doing to individuals and basically their mortality.
I think it's it's really psychological, because if you are on one hand saying to people that obesity is their fault, that they are obviously eating too much, not moving enough, and not taking actually into consideration the environment, which actually encourages everybody to do this. You remove all that and you actually say to people, you've got to a point, there's nothing you can do past this point. You are always, even if you go on a very low calorie diet, as soon as you come off it, it's not going to have changed any of your your sort of hormones. You're still going to feel really hungry. You're still not going to realize when you've had enough to eat. You're just going to put it back on and more besides. So you might have lost, 10 stone in 10 months, or using one of these very low calorie liquid diets. Mm-hmm. But it's such a huge thing to keep that weight off. And what do? We say, we blame them again. Oh, it's your fault. Look at you. So it's like a defense mechanism for people to say, well, I'm happy as I am. I'm body positive. You can't shame me. And it's like, nobody should be shaming anybody.
Oh, you see, that's the point. I'm not talking about shaming. I'm talking about a reality of the situation, that at the end of the day, you're the one who's hip, whose knee, whose ankle. If you're carrying around with you
An extra
basically,
person.
An extra person,
Yeah.
you will feel that in your body.
Yeah. I
And
mean,
it'll-
this
so
is well,
what
this
do you do?
yeah, well, and this is again, because that's what I'm saying. It's like you saying that. I don't think it's shaming someone. It's offering somebody an alternative and offering somebody an option, which most people don't get. But what people get now, it is that they feel they need to defend themselves. Like, I'm happy as I am, and I just thinking back to my larger days, and God, I wish I could have said I'm happy as I was so unhappy, and purely because, the dieting didn't work. I was a constant failure. The dieting didn't work. I literally starved myself all the time and still didn't get any thinner. I literally must have lost the same 2 stone 50 times, And I think this is what we have to really understand, that when you have a weight issue, it's a metabolic issue. It's not just about you've ate too much and you're not moving enough. It literally is your hormones are haywire. That there needs to be an intervention, and it needs to be seen, as surgery needs to be seen as like a real intervention, much as if you have a cast pot on your arm if you break it. Or we wouldn't think twice about, any kind of other physical intervention if the body needed it. But for some reason, and I'm not being cynical about this, for some reason, it's like we want to put people who have metabolic diseases in some sort of holding pattern with medication for life that doesn't actually tackle the underlying thing. If somebody doesn't want to carry extra weight, then we should be offering all of them different options. And I think at present, the waiting list to have it done in the UK and the NHS is ridiculously long. So unless you've got additional money, and then, even if you have the bariatric surgery, then you're sort of battling to have, like, what they call body contouring, because you're left with quite a lot of excess skin, which is a completely different story. But I think we need to, sort of, for anybody who's listening to this, and this has been their journey, is to stop thinking there's something wrong with you because the diet isn't working. Diets are never going to work, not when you have a lot of excess weight to lose, because your brain and your nervous system and your metabolic system have adapted, and it's really difficult to change that without having some sort of surgical intervention. So don't feel a failure.
So is it what I said originally then, that as I put it, that the muscle memory is such that it keeps you where you are because you've gone to that over several years? I mean, and so is the way to challenge this from the beginning rather than later on, that we go back to sensible eating from the outset? Would that be correct?
That brings me back to the question that I was going to ask, because I wanted to circle back to the point that both of you made about the role of the housewife, right? Because I think actually, like I'm in agreement on this. One of the things that's always irked me about being a mum is when from the kickoff, from the point when you're first pregnant, the NHS says to you, breastfeeding is free, right? Well, yes, but the assumption that's such a sweeping statement, because breastfeeding is free if you assume that the role of the mother is worth nothing.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So.
Sorry, can I just stop? What do you mean? What do you mean by that? The role of the mother is worth nothing? Surely giving the nutrients to the newborn is more important than anything else.
Of course it is. But they're not saying, like, semantically, they could be saying breastfeeding is valued. Breastfeed, just like you've just said, just like you've outlined, but they don't. They say breastfeeding is free, so you should breastfeed, right? So that in itself is a very high pressure statement to be making, right? Breastfeeding is free. That's a quite high, not you are a goddess if you are breastfeeding your child. They don't say that. The NHS just says breastfeeding is free, so breast is best, right? But also, you know, back in the day, back in like even in my mum's days, you know, when you went into hospital to have a baby, you'd stay in hospital for about 2 weeks, and they'd teach you how to nurture and support and look after your child. You know, now it's like, well, you're in and out in 24 hours if there's no complication.
Do they still have the health worker who comes around and says,
oh God. Oh my God, don't even get me started about the health worker. Well, don't even get me started.
This maternity health worker used to come in and say, this is what you do, blah, blah, blah. This is how you hold baby. This is how you do. Because obviously in the old days, that was what your mother would be telling you, or the mother-in-law would be telling you. Yeah? Because we were disconnected, a lot of people didn't have that. So they needed this health worker. I can't remember what was a full title was, Dr. Rachel, but anyway, she used to come in supposedly and say, this is how you do things. Is that not a good system? Or was that not a good system?
Well, I think, again, you know, and this is really interesting, because what Fergus was just talking about was like sort of attachment and, you know, good relations between and bonding between mother and child. And there's some really interesting evidence which shows that insecure attachment actually has a relationship with obesity. Right. So not having secure attachment. And interestingly, even for people who have bariatric surgery, if they have an insecure avoidant or insecure anxious attachment style, they will lose less weight than people who have a secure attachment style having the same surgery.
Right.
So it's very interesting, because, you know, human beings are and I say this all the time, you know, I do. Human beings are really, really social, and what we are actually doing, what our society is doing, is breaking down sort of social sort of attachments, and also disempowering people, and in particular women, around the whole of sort of having children and nursing children and everything like that. And it's having such a significant impact on the environment on whole, but the health and well-being of people within that environment. We're not valuing the right things, and just the most fundamental thing that a human being needs is a secure attachment and love from people who are going to care for them. That's a fundamental thing, and if we've not got that, then most of our mechanisms within our brain, the functions within our brain, are actually not going to be as they should be, and that has a knock-on effect for the rest of the body.
Right. So if let me just try and get this understanding, because in this discussion, are we basically saying right from the offset, baby, mother, okay, very important. Are we saying right from the offset that all of how we tend to become, all of what we tend to be in the future, is all guided from this very first learnings that we do in this process? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and it's not just mother, it's any primary carer. So basically our attachment mechanisms and our blueprints that we lay down for life are actually imprinted within our limbic system and our brain before we are 18 months old, before we know that we are separate from our primary carers. We have been given the blueprints of how we should see other human beings and how we should attach to other human beings.
So if we replace the mother, then say the mother's replaced at birth, does that make a difference?
Well, if it replaced with somebody who's, you know, going to give that child love and, you know, security and safety and meet that child's needs, you know, you can have interchangeable, you know, primary carers, but the important thing to sort of understand with that is you cannot get away from biology, and mothers have a certain mechanism that bonds them to their baby, and that's different to the bonds that are done by fathers, you know. And at the risk of being really unpopular, because I know people, you know, like social identity and everything like that, you know, you cannot argue with biological mechanisms. You know, evolution didn't really account for social identity. So from an evolution perspective, mothers have different oxytocin receptors to father. Mothers have the oxytocin receptors that allow them to, produce breast milk. Fathers don't do that naturally. So, in the most sympathetic and gentle of ways, so that there's no offense to anybody who identifies as anything else, we have to look at the impact of not understanding or ignoring some of the biological facts. So, and human beings need to have secure attachments. And we need to understand the mechanisms that happen both from a female and a male perspective, and how that feeds in to creating really strong societies. And this is what we want, surely, or is it, Carlton? Because you all know from your perspective, how useful is it to people in power to have strong, secure communities?
Well, yeah, do you know what? So I'm going to just chip in here. There's a couple of things I wanted to say, right? There's a book that, it came out about 15 years ago. It's by a woman called Pamela Drucker, and it's called Why French Women Don't Get Fat. And it's all about how, even in the sorts of pre-weaning stage, French mothers will just let the baby try out lots of food experiences, and obviously French cuisine is kind of known for the sort of 6-course meals and the gastronomy, and everything's, the portions are quite small, but everything's quite dense and rich and whatever. And actually, I remember when my eldest was about 11 months old, and we lived in France for about 6 months, and we'd go to a restaurant, and not only would they sort of treat my son like he was a grown-up, they'd bring out like a glass of milk in like a martini glass and stuff like that, and they'd lay out the table with proper cutlery and all the rest of it, not expecting in a million years that he'd be throwing it on the floor or anything, but like the chef would come out and they'd say, oh, would he like the lamb bone, would he like the duck leg or something to chew on or whatever, because it was just such a commonplace thing to just give, instead of giving the baby a teether, give it a duck leg to chew on or whatever.
I apparently enjoyed a T-bone when I was a baby, Fergus.
Well, yeah, but so there is that, I mean, are we a bit too because even baby food these days, right, you get these pouches, right, and it's like this sort of, it's mush, it's like the sort of thing I imagine, I don't know, Carlton, you can tell us like what army rations are like, but I mean, I imagine this is worse than army rations. Like baby food at the moment, it comes in like a pouch. The pouch probably has a shelf life of about 3 months, so they tell you it's fresh, but it's not fresh. It's just mush, right? It's basically just puree stuff in a pouch format that it's now acceptable for kids to just sort of squeeze into their mouth. There's no even eating it on a plate or consuming it in a in a food way. Like there's not even that, like, look, let's do the aeroplane thing and spoon it into your mouth. So just sort of circling back to what you were saying, Dr. Rachel, about making eating an experience rather than a function, I suppose. That would be point one. My point two, right? I read something in The Economist, Carlton, and you can tell me whether or not this is true. So a question that Dr. Rachel asked you about, whether we should be building societies that are healthy and have a healthy relationship with food. I read something in The Economist that the Russian army's basically drunk all the time. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer both those questions if I can. So the first one, the army. Of course, I wasn't a soldier. I worked for the American, and I worked with with our forces, obviously, and with many other. Now, what I did notice with our forces, we were still. Let's take us back to Iraq, 2003, 2004. What I noticed with British Army, they were still sort of cooking up in a mess tin, in the field I'm talking about now. I'm not talking about when you come back to the base. In the field, they're still on a mess tin and they're cooking up little foods that they're putting in there. Whereas the Americans had a thing called, which was ingenious, called an MRE, which means a meal ready to eat. And that was a package which you had. And if you open up the package, you then had spaghetti bolognese, or they'd have things like jerk chicken and rice, or they'd have, because they were orientating it to the soldiers which they had in the United States military, what they might eat. So Chinese Americans, West Indian Americans, Latin Americans, Irish Americans, and they were cooking up various foods for the different soldiers which they had in there, and you could choose. And basically you'd have a pack and it'd say on it, this contains spaghetti bolognese. And then you'd have your spaghetti bolognese, which when you opened it would instantaneously combust, so heat it up for you. You didn't need a fire, it heated it up to eating temperature. I mean, it's superbly done. Then you had, and I ate quite a bit of that in the beginning because I was with the American in some of that period. And then they had, with it, you'd also get something like some sort of chocolate bar, Hershey bar as they see it. You'd have a drink which was calorifically valued as a drink, and you'd have a dessert. And all that was in one packet, and it was aimed to give you what you require as a soldier to be able to go into battle. Right? So actually very, very well done. We seemed in the British Army to still be scavenging really to get enough water to boil, to make a drink, to do this, to do that. Of course they're spending, it's the big difference, they're spending nearly $1 trillion a year on their military. So when you spend $1 trillion, thousands of $1 million a year, then you get bang meals ready to eat. So their army. Now as for the Russians, I think post the end of the Soviet Union, I think most Russians were drunk. So I think you would probably see that because of the end of the Soviet Union and frankly the exploitation of the West on Russia, basically to make sure it would never be a threat and to make it a destroyed country, and to take everything out of it that we could and allow various oligarchs to come to the fore, and etc. What happened at the end of the Soviet Union under Yeltsin and our direction of that, when I say ours, American, because the American people were actually informing them how they should function to come into the capitalist world, because of course it's now capitalist. Basically, a lot of people who under the old communist regimes all had jobs. Even if they didn't make anything, they still had a job which paid, and you had some element of value. But when you haven't got any element of value and everybody's thrown out of work and etc., then of course a lot of people turn to the devil drink, and that's what happened with a lot of Russians. And this is what people don't understand. This is why many, if not the vast majority, I would say the vast majority of Russians love Putin. Because President Putin actually gave them back some self-respect, started telling them, you are great, you were great, we can be great again, etc., and not just in the Trump way, when America is already great and got the largest economy in the world and should be able to feed its people, but actually doing something for its people and raising their standard, which they've done. So in the past that was true, is what I'm trying to say. It is still relatively true, but not to the same extent. But it's not to do with the old communism, it's to do with what happened after communism and the devaluation of them under capitalism, and then the reassertion. So, no, it's not all drunk, and I think you can see that from the way they're fighting in Ukraine. So that's what I'd say with that. But we come back to another thing that Dr. Rachel, you said that I'd like for you to come back onto. I don't think that governments are I know. Governments in the West, in the East, wherever, maybe the slight exception of the Chinese that basically try to work out everything in advance for the next 20 odd years or whatever. But I don't think governments actually have the handle that we think they have. I think they try to steer things in certain directions, but there's a whole panoply of other things coming to them that don't allow them to function as they think. The problem is for most politicians that we have in the West and in other countries is that they first look after themselves. And that's where the problem then comes from. Yeah. Because they look after themselves. And if you have powerful industries like the food industry, that can lobby you. And let's take the American system. Let's just take that because it's the easiest to show this destabilization. If it takes now what somebody said the other day to me, that it takes something like, I think he said 8 billion or 8, one of the two figures, both are humongous, to make a president, right? That president cannot come into power not owing people. So the food industry goes to Washington. It has its individuals who it calls lobbyists, we may call corruptors, and they go in and they turn around and they say, listen, President-to-be, I'll back you, but what I want to happen is I want the growth hormones to be able to be put into chickens, and I don't want that changing. This guy agrees, bosh, it won't be changed. Now, to make sure he's going to tell the truth, they also tie up the senators, and then they also tie up some of the guys in the House of Representatives. And so if that president from a particular party tries to move in a direction, then his people who are senators, who are representatives, can say, hey, hold on, this is our policy. Right? So what I'm saying is it's corrupted, and the bigger the industry is, the more you can corrupt.
Exactly, and that's what the population at large is always going to suffer the fallout of that.
Correct.
And this is why I try to speak to people and work with anybody who wants it to start getting people to look at the messaging, look at the influencing, and just start to think themselves about who is this benefiting.
Correct.
They
don't do that though, do they? People don't do that.
No, they don't.
So that was part 1 of this week's Black Spy podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll have part 2 next week.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.